Okay, let's continue on with when and where we're supposed to report the 8938. So here is just a quick snapshot of, the first page on the 8938, which could have an infinite number of pages. Now, I'll jump into a quick example of something that I had done for someone with an 8938. So we had a client living in India who had over 100 different foreign assets between bank accounts, stocks, and securities. And we filed upwards of a 100-page 8938. So that's just a very quick example of how long this form can actually be. So that it can actually make the tax return really, really long, which is pretty unique and interesting in that circumstance. So when do we report the 8938? We report it with our tax return. It's due on the due date. So if the tax return gets a 6-month extension to October, then we have till October to file this report. But if the client is going to file the return by the April 15th deadline, then this report would also be due by that time. And then, of course, who receives the 8938? I think we answered that question earlier in this presentation, and that is, of course, the IRS receives this report, or I guess we would say form. Okay, now, always the big question on clients' minds as well as accountants' minds: what if we have a client who does not comply with filing the 8938? Well, it's up to $10,000 for failure to disclose, an additional $10,000 for every 30 days of non-filing after the IRS notice of a failure to disclose. So if the IRS doesn't notify you for a long time, well, that extra $10,000 for every 30 days does not apply until they send a notice. And then the maximum penalty is $50,000. There's also criminal penalties could apply. So if you're really doing some offshore if you or your client's doing some offshore hiding of money, then there could be some serious criminal penalties included as well. So don't just put the cap at 50, because it could go far beyond 50,000. Okay, let's jump into some cases on applying what we've learned today in the FBAR and 8938 Basics. So this first case is about Caleb and his spouse. So Caleb and his spouse are non-resident aliens living inside the United States. They have $105,000 in a joint Swiss bank account on the last day of the 2017 tax year. Does Caleb and his spouse have an FBAR filing requirement? Okay, so if you're away from the screen right now, let's come back and let's apply some of the principles that you've learned during this presentation. And the answer is no. Caleb and spouse are non-resident aliens. So if you remember back to the beginning of the presentation, non-resident aliens are not required to file an FBAR. Okay, now the second question. Does Caleb and his spouse have an 8938 filing requirement? The answer is yes. Non-resident aliens must file if they meet the filing threshold, which in this case, because they are living in the U.S. and they have more than $105,000 in a foreign account on the last day of the year, I think the threshold was $100,000 on the last day of the year, then they do have the requirement to file the 8938. So this is one of those unique cases where they don't have an FBAR, but they do have an 8938 filing requirement. Okay, case number 2. Truman is not married and lives in India, where he trains subject matter experts. He has an aggregate value of $9,999 US in 5 personal foreign bank accounts at the end of the 2017 tax year. Truman received a bank transfer from his U.S. employer, Canopy Tax, in November of 2017 into an account in which he has signature authority. The transfer from his company in the amount of $290,000 is for him to buy a lot of houses for future employees. He spent the money before December 31st, okay? And you're going to find that these questions are going to be common amongst each case, which is, does he have an FBAR filing requirement, and does he have an 8938 filing requirement? Yes, he has a FBAR filing requirement because the signature authority accounts, okay? And they are reported. So even though he has $9,999 in his personal accounts, well, he also has signature authority over this $290,000. So that put him over the $10,000 threshold. So he is required to file an FBAR. Now the next question, does he have an FBAR filing requirement? The answer is no, because the requirement is $200,000 on the last day of the tax year, or $300,000 at any time during the tax year. And another thing to note is signature authority accounts are not reported on the 8938. So even if signature authority accounts were reported on the 8938, he still wouldn't have a filing requirement because the $290,000 was less than the $300,000 threshold, and he spent that money before the last day of the tax year. So he didn't even meet the $200,000 threshold on the last day of the tax year. Okay. So yes on the FBAR and no on the 8938. So there's kind of a pattern here. The first case we had a no because there was a non-resident alien. Yes on the second case because of the signature authority account. And then yes on the 8938 on the first case and no on this case. So let's get on to case number 3. So we're going to go through about 6 of these. So for number 3, Harry and Mary are U.S. citizens living in the United Kingdom and will file a married filing joint tax return. They receive frequent payments from their employer into their joint bank account for expat items such as schooling, car, housing, etc. They receive $400,000 for housing in February, $150,000 in March for a car, and $60,000 in April for schooling. And I think it's important to note, all of this money was spent within 24 hours of being received, right? Because, of course everyone wants to be paid. They have a house they're living in. Of course their realtor wants his money. So they spend that money immediately, right when it comes into their bank account. They need to pay for their car. They need to pay for their kids' schooling. So, the money's in, the money's out. So just like we've done on previous cases, do Harry and Mary have an FBAR filing requirement? Yes, of course they do. They had, even if the money was only there for 10 minutes, well, they had more than $10,000 in a U.S. bank account at any time during the tax year. So, yes, they're required to file an FBAR. Now, are they required to file an 8938? The answer is no. Because the money was going into one account and the max value of the account during the year was $400,000. The requirement is $600,000 during the year and $400,000 at the end of the year. So hopefully that's very clear on the distinction of the either or method that I like to use.